Chapter 9, International Trade. I keep saying that Chapter 9 is part of really Chapter 7 and part of Chapter 8. It's really one big chapter, as you'll see here. I'm going to focus on two primary models and then an extension of one of them, and then you will be responsible for reading about and learning about the last part of the chapter, which is on arguments against trade. And so what we will cover is what determines how much of a good a country will import or export. Actually, we'll answer that now. It depends on comparative advantage. Which nation has the comparative advantage in a particular good? Then in free markets, that nation, if you have the comparative advantage, meaning you're the low cost producer, then you can offer that at a lower price, then you will be the nation that has the reason to export, right? Other nations will want to buy from you because you are the low cost producer. Who benefits from trade? We'll also address this here right now rather quickly, but then we'll come back to it when we're looking at these models. Is remember in chapters 2 or 3 where we were covering chapter 3, the gains from trade, right? Interdependence and the gains from trade. Why do we even trade? Why do you even ever buy anything, or why do you even sell anything? It's to make yourself better off, right? So individuals trade to make ourselves better off. We won't do it if we're worse off. I mean, we might make a mistake, but we won't consistently do it if we're worse off, right? So same thing when we're trading between nations, right? Because this is a chapter on international trade, so we're talking about trade between nations. And it's the same thing with nations. Nations as a whole have to be better off in order for it to make sense for them to trade. However, within a nation, not everyone is better off. So, for example, if the United States were to start importing all of its cars from abroad, well, who would be better off? Well, if the rest of the cars in the rest of the world are cheaper, then the consumers of cars here in the United States, the importers, the consumers of cars would be better off. Who would be worse off? Well, the producers of cars here in the United States. They're not going to be happy about it. So if we're trading, then it better be the case that the gains to the winners exceed the loss to the losers. And that's what we'll see when we start modeling both the model of imports and then the model of exports. Okay, and then we'll talk about an extension on the import model on how we can restrict trade by imposing tariffs. And we'll model that and we'll see the direct impacts of that. And then lastly, as I said, you are responsible for reading this part because this is pretty straightforward and pretty easy to read. We'll be using the tablet for this entire lecture, I'm pretty sure, for most of it, if not all of it. As I was saying, a nation that has a comparative advantage in the production of a good means they are the low-cost producer, which means that they will be the ones producing the good for the rest of the world. It makes sense for that to be the case, right? So we can, if we exchange based on comparative advantage, which we do, by the way, in the real world, then nations can be better off because of this. And in fact, the world could be more efficient, right? Because we're talking about opportunity cost, the lowest opportunity cost. Again, when I make a computer, I give up the least amount of wheat. It's not about the cost of labor, the cost of metal. It's about who gives up the least in the production of the other good. And so it's actually pretty efficient for us to be exporting and importing to each other. So let's go and look at the model in which we start, the nation starts to export. But first, let's set up some vocabulary here, or some terms. PW is going to be what we call the world price, that if we were to enter the world market for a particular good, that is the prevailing price in that market. PD is the domestic price without trade. So the price that would exist if we weren't trading with the rest of the world. Basically, it would be P star in without trade with the rest of the world. It'd be where our supply curve or our demand curve or a particular supply and demand curves intersect when they're not trading with the rest of the world. And if the domestic price, the price that exists in that particular nation when they are not trading, were less than the world price, then it makes sense that the rest of the world wants to buy stuff from this particular nation, right? That this nation exports goods to another nation because they are the low-cost producer. And if the opposite is the case, if the world price for this particular good or service is lower than the domestic price, then someone in the rest of the world, or the market, the world market, has the comparative advantage in the production of the good. This nation does not. So we can even say that this nation has the comparative disadvantage. And so if we're trading freely, then that means that this nation would import the good because it's cheaper abroad. We are going to make what we call the small economy assumption. And by small, we mean small relative to the size of the world market. We don't mean small in geographic space. We don't mean small in terms of population. We mean small in terms of the market. So the market, the world market is big, let's say, and when this particular nation opens up its ports and it starts trading with in the world market, it's almost as if it's not even noticed. And the reason we do this is because it will make this nation a price taker. It won't change the world price. That way we're not moving that world price line around. We can relax this assumption, but to be honest, at a principles level, we don't gain any more insight. So it's not worth it. It really complicates the model, and it's not worth relaxing this assumption if we make a large country assumption, meaning that a large country enters relative to the size of the market, and they are a price mover. They influence the price. So again, it's not worth it because we don't really learn much from that, even though it's more realistic. Okay, so let's go on, and let's use the whiteboard here. Let's begin with the export model. So, exports. When would a nation export? We just talked about that, right? A nation will export when its domestic price is, is lower than than the world price, right? Okay, my tablet's acting up. So when the domestic price is lower than the world price, let me try writing that again down here. PD is less than oh goodness, yay, fabulous. There we go, is less than PW, right? So that's when it makes sense for this nation to be exporting because again, it's the low cost producer. And so let's start off by drawing what we call autarky. And this isn't something that's really emphasized in the book, but I do want you to know this language because it is common language used to address a situation in which a nation is not trading in a particular good. And so here we go. We have Q and we have P. And our domestic demand and our domestic supply. So let me emphasize that once again. This is the supply by whatever nation we're talking about. Let's call it nation X. The supply by the people within the borders of nation X, the suppliers of nation X, and the demanders of nation X down here. Okay, people within the borders of nation X. And so what I was talking about earlier when I was saying autarky, this right here that we've been modeling, I haven't addressed this before, but when a nation is not trading, then this is considered to be autarky equilibrium. And that's what that means. Autarky means no trade with the rest of the world. Of course, they're trading with each other, but no trade with the rest of the world. So this is autarky equilibrium. And at autarky equilibrium, that's when we have our equilibrium price, which we've now called the domestic price, D for domestic, not for demand. And then the equilibrium quantity in autarky. So we can just call that Q star. Okay. And so now if the world price is above the domestic price, that means it's up here somewhere. All right, so I'm going to call this PW. This is the world price. Okay. And now I'm going to label the areas in here. And like I said before, this is alphabet soup. We'll be using lots of letters for this chapter as well. And it's okay to overlabel, but it's never okay to underlabel. Okay? And so I'm going to call this A, B, C, and D. So A, B, C, and D. And I'm going to set up a table that we will use, just like we did in the previous chapter, to analyze the welfare impacts of trading with the rest of the world, of exporting for this particular nation. So I'm going to ask about consumer surplus, producer surplus. I'm going to include tax revenue in here to the government. So if you want to call it government revenue, tax revenue, same thing. Even though there is no taxation in this particular problem, it's a good habit to ask yourself every time, are there taxes? Are there taxes? Are there taxes? Even if it means you end up putting dashes throughout here, it's just a good habit to ask yourself so that you never miss the fact that there could potentially be taxes in the market, and don't forget to analyze the welfare impacts of a tax. So all included in here. And then total surplus. And then we'll look at it under autarky, meaning no trade. And then we'll look at trade exporting with under free trade, meaning free of government intervention. And by free trade here, I do mean free international trade. So actually, let me take a moment to emphasize this here. I'm going to write this out as free international trade. So this nation is trading with the rest of the world, but there's no government intervention, meaning the government is not imposing any taxes or restricting the amount that could be exchanged. So let me emphasize that under both of these situations, both this one and this one, we're assuming free trade, except autarky is that it's free trade between the people in the nation, not with the rest of the world, meaning there's no government intervention, but the nation is not trading with the rest of the world under this condition on the left, autarky. And under free international trade, it is trading with the rest of the world, but again, there's no government intervention. Okay, so both of them are free trade, except one of them is international and the other one isn't. And then we'll look at the net change. And so we know that the price when they start trading with the rest of the world is PW, but in autarky, it's as if that PW doesn't apply. It doesn't apply because they're not in the world market. So the price that applies is PD, and we know what consumer surplus is when our regular domestic supply curve intersects with our regular demand curve, right? Consumer surplus is the area below demand and above price because the price is PD in autarky and they buy Q star units. So that means consumer surplus is A and B. Producer surplus is easy as well. The price is here, the supply curve is there, therefore producer surplus is D. There is no tax revenue because I haven't even mentioned anything about taxes in this story. It's just a placeholder. And therefore total surplus is A, B, D. Right? A, B, D. Okay. Free international trade. Now they are trading with the rest of the world. This price right here disappears. It's gone. They are no longer in their closed economy. They are trading with the rest of the world, and since they are a small country, when they start trading with the rest of the world, they do not influence price. The applicable price is PW. They don't have a choice between PD and PW. It's not like when we're buying or selling, we're checking, hey, let me check your citizenship. No, that's not what happens. We are now in this big market for the world market. And even if they did do the citizenship, they have the incentive here, the domestic producers, to charge this higher price. They don't want to check citizenship, right? Why? Because there's a higher price that they can sell it at because now they're participating in this world market, right? They are the low-cost producers. They're participating in the world market. Why not sell it at PW when you can sell it at PW? So the applicable price is PW. So if that's the price, think about consumers, right? Here's the price. You go take that price and crash into the demand curve, and that gives you the quantity demanded at a price of PW. So if that's the price and that's how many units they buy, then that means consumer surplus is just A, meaning that consumers lost the whole area B. And now producers, they're getting PW. And at that price, domestic producers are saying, hey, we like high prices. We want to provide more to the market. The law of supply has kicked in. So now, if that's the price, here's the supply curve, then that means producer surplus is what? B, C, D. So they gain B, C, and D. Oh, no, not D. They already had D. Right? They gain B and C. Let me erase this little part there. And tax revenue, again, doesn't exist. It's just a placeholder. It's a good habit to have. And now total surplus under free international trade is A, B, C, and D. And if we look at the difference between here and here, we see that we've gained C. Or if we come down this way, We see that what consumers lost in B was picked up by producers, but C is brand new, right? C, area C right here. This right here is brand new. No one in this economy, in this domestic economy, had C before, and this is what we call, as you should expect, gains from trade. Because if we were not better off as a nation, why the hell would we trade? It does not make sense for us to trade. And so that's one thing to know, okay, that a nation as a whole is better off. Who benefits? Well, the whole nation as a whole. But internally, there are winners and losers. Who are the losers if we start exporting? Well, it's domestic consumers, right? They lose B. That sucks. Who are the winners? Domestic producers, right? They're able to produce more and get a higher price. They love that. They gain B and C. And notice that the gains to the winners, the gains to the producers, B and C, exceed the losses to the losers of B. Right? So we will always, whether we're exporting or importing, here we just graphically prove that we have the gains to the winners exceeding the losses to the losers. But when we start trading with the rest of the world, we're always going to have some people saying, yes, let's do it, and some people saying, no, don't do it. Why? Because there will always be winners and losers from trading with the rest of the world. But in net as a whole, once again, the nation is better off. Okay, so these are exports. Now let's model imports. If we are importing, if nation X is importing, then it must be the case that its domestic price is higher than the world price. The world market is the low-cost producer. That's why we import. And so we're going to do the same thing, model on the left, table on the right. Domestic demand, domestic supply, autarky equilibrium, by the way, whoa, I did not point something out here. Back to exports. At PW, let me see, I'll do this in black. At PW touches our domestic demand curve here, right? So this here, this is quantity demanded when we're trading with the rest of the world freely. So FT, free trade with the rest of the world, okay? Free international trade. And quantity supplied is here under, again, free international trade, FT for free trade. And so domestic producers are providing QS, domestic consumers only want QD. It's not that we have a surplus, it's that this is what is being exported. I can't believe I forgot to mention this, but here I am. These are the exports. Maybe our domestic producers are only buying 100 million units, and our domestic consumers and our domestic producers are making 160 million. That means that 60 million, because our domestic producers are making 160 million, 60 million of these units are being exported. 100 are being purchased domestically, and then 60 million is going abroad. All right, so there isn't a surplus. The market is clearing. It's just now the buyers are part domestic and part international. Okay, now to imports. So we're in autarky, and actually let me call this PD, domestic price. And the world price is down here. That's PW. And so we can ask ourselves, right, what do we need to know? We need to know the welfare impacts. So what do we need to set up? We need to set up the table. So let's do that. We're going to ask about consumer surplus, about producer surplus, about tax revenue, total surplus. We'll look at the situation under autarky, and then free international trade, or trade with imports if you want to call it that. And then the net change. Okay. And so we'll need letters, and I'll have A, B, this whole big region I'll call C, and then D. I mean, I could call it, again, you can overlabel. I can call this C and D and E if I want. Watch, let's do that. That's okay. And I can even go further if I wanted to. F and G. I know I don't need F and G. You don't know that yet, even if you've studied this one time by reading the book, which you're supposed to have done by now. You know, you're kind of still getting used to what do you need to fill in, what don't you need to fill in. I know we don't need F and G, so I'm going to erase it. But again, don't worry if you overlabel. Be concerned if you underlabel. Like if I forgot to label B, that's a problem. Okay. All right. And so consumer surplus under autarky, well, the price is PD. That should be easy. Boom. A. Producer surplus, the price is PD. They're selling Q star, B and E. That should be easy. Tax revenue, there is none. The story doesn't say anything about taxes, and therefore total surplus is ABE, which is what we're used to, right? That triangular, big triangular area. Okay, free international trade. Consumers are now paying the world price. They love that. Demand is here. Price is PW. They're buying this many units. This is quantity demanded under free trade. That should make sense that quantity demanded increases because it's a lower price. We like lower prices as consumers. So we end up getting consumer surplus being A, B, C, D. So consumers gained, nope, not B, gained C. No, yes, B, yes, B, yes, B. Gained B, gained C, gained D. That's consumer surplus. Producer surplus, producers are not happy. We're importing this good from the rest of the world because the price is lower. Producers are like, oh, price is lower, that sucks. Here's my supply curve. There's the price. We producers don't want to provide as much to the market. Here's the quantity supplied under free trade. All right, so producers are worse off. They only have E. They have lost B. They are not happy. Let me zoom in here so I can erase this. Okay, so they lost B. Tax revenue, again, non-existent. Total surplus under free trade, A, B, C, D, E. Again, going from here to here or going down, let's go down. What was lost in B by producers was picked up by consumers, but C and D never existed before in terms of welfare. So this nation as a whole has gained C and D. In other words, there are gains from trade. Of course there are. There has to be, as a whole. And so where is that area? I'll show it in red. It's here, which I had previously just called C, by the way, the whole area. Anyway, so C and D, right? So this is additional surplus. Before, without trade, we only get this. But with trade, we picked up that dashed area, right? Because we're trading with the rest of the world. And once again, you'll notice that the gains to the winners, B, C, and D, exceed the losses to the losers, negative B, right? So as a whole, the nation is better off. Producers would fight this. If we weren't trading and we were putting up a proposal to start trading, who's going to fight this? Producers. Why? Because they're going to lose B. And if B is worth $3 million, they're going to be willing to put up to $3 million towards lobbying to fight this effort. Consumers are like, nah, we're good with this policy, right? Because we're better off. We would get it for a lower price. And so, given that at PW consumers buy this much and producers only make this much, quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied, that's not a shortage. This is the amount of units that will be imported. This many from here to here are produced by domestic producers. Which ones, by the way? The low-cost producers. These folks here. The low-cost producers. Not the high-cost. These high-cost producers cannot compete at this lower price. Right? They're the ones that are not happy. I mean, so are the other ones because they're getting a lower price. But the ones up here are especially unhappy. And so this here is what we get from domestic producers. And then the rest of this part, oh, I went a little too far. The rest of this part between here and here, we're getting it from abroad. Okay. This is imports. When we're importing from the rest of the world. Why do we do it? Because as a nation, we are better off. All right, one more model, then we're done. We're going to model imports, but with a tariff. The government decides to impose a tariff. And a tariff, as you know, is a tax on imports. Okay, it's a tax on imports. So we're going to model imports with a tariff. Remember how in chapter 7 we talked about welfare economics and how if the government gets involved and they throw us off of our equilibrium point, where our supply curve intersects our demand curve, that the total surplus necessarily shrinks. It has to, because we either deviate to the left or we deviate to the right. Same thing here, by the way. If the government gets involved, then we will shrink total surplus. It will necessarily, it has to, because the free market left on its own, assuming it can get to its happy place, meaning assuming it can get to its efficient point, there's no way, by definition, to increase total surplus. There isn't. There's no way. So if the government gets involved, it will necessarily shrink the size of the economic pie. And so now we have the government getting involved. It will distort incentives using a market tool, using taxes, essentially fundamentally changing the price, and total surplus will end up shrinking. All right, so let's model this. And let's see, I'll need a little bit more space. And where will I put that table? Will it fit? Yeah, it will. Okay, so we have Q, we have P, domestic demand, domestic supply, and we're going to compare not autarky to trade with a tariff, but free international trade to trade with a tariff. So it's no longer free. Again, it's not free of government intervention. And so the price under free trade is PW, right? If we're importing, that means the price is below autarky price, which is here. But again, if we're trading already, this doesn't exist. We're in the world market. And so PW is here, the free market price, but then the government comes in and says, nope, it's got to be higher. We are imposing a tax, a tariff on the goods, right? So T stands for tariff. So it's the world price plus the amount of that tariff. And basically from here to here, that's the tariff, T. All right, it's increasing the amount of the price by the tariff. And here we're assuming it's a per unit price. So $2 more per unit. Okay? And so let's ask ourselves again, what is the impact on the market? So let's identify, first of all, what would be purchased under the free market situation. Assuming we're trading with the rest of the world, then this is going to be the quantity demand, not quantity demanded, quantity supplied under free international trade, FT. And this over here will be the quantity demanded under free international trade. So between here and here are the imports with free trade, right? How much would be importing if we're trading freely with the rest of the world? The government comes in and says, nope, 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 we're imposing a tariff. Okay, well, tariff increases the price. Consumers are not going to be happy about that. Actually, that's right. Consumers are not going to be happy about that. Let me get another pin here. Consumers aren't going to be happy about that. Consumers are going to say, hey, you're imposing this higher price. Higher prices suck for consumers, so their quantity demanded is going to go down. At PW plus T, their effective price, this is where that price line touches the demand curve. So this is the quantity demanded with the tariff. Producers are like, hell yeah, we're going to get higher prices. So quantity supplied kicks in. They increase their quantity supplied. And price touches here. So that's how many units they'll be providing. Here's quantity supplied under the tariff situation. And so you'll notice that we now have imports shrinking, right? Imports have shrunk because there's a tariff imposed, right? Imports with a tariff. Right, so imports have shrunk because there's a tariff imposed, both because quantity supplied went up and because quantity demanded went down. Okay, so both of these things happened at the same time. And so tariffs discourage trade, which once again you should be able to think about, well, hey, that's inefficient. Because had that government not been involved, you and I would have traded. It would have been beneficial. We are the best judges of what is good, what we believe to be good for us. Given this price, is it worth it for me? Whether I'm a seller or a buyer, right? So the government's getting involved, it will necessarily shrink the total surplus. Let's call these regions out here. I'm going to say this is A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and H. Those are the ones I absolutely need. So again, A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, and H. Okay. And let's analyze the welfare impacts. So we're going to ask about consumer surplus, producer surplus. Now there is a tax. So tax revenue is something we definitely need to know about. And then total surplus. So consumer surplus under free international trade. Again, free international trade, the price is PW. Here's the demand curve. So therefore consumer surplus is, oh goodness, that's a lot of letters. A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. That's right. A, B, C. Yep. So that's consumer surplus. I'm going to zoom in here to erase this line. Otherwise I erase too much. Okay. Producer surplus, well, they're getting PW, and they are only providing QSFT. So then producer surplus is just H. And H could be a lot. It just happens to look small in the way I drew this. But H could be a lot. Okay. Tax revenue, well, it's free. International trade, so no tax revenue there. Total surplus is therefore A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and H. Right? As we've seen before, right? Total surplus under free trade is kind of like, I don't know, half a sailboat it looks like. Right? This region here. Right, the part that we picked up because we went from autarky to free trade would have been C, E, F, and G. That would be the gains from trade, right? That was our previous analysis. Here we're not going from autarky to free trade with tariffs. Here we're just saying free trade to trade with free international trade to trade with tariffs. Okay. So now trade with tariff, the price that's in effect is PW plus T. Do the same thing as always. If you know the definitions of consumer surplus and producer surplus, you will not struggle here. So if the price is PW plus T, here's the price. It touches the demand curve over here. There's the demand curve. Therefore, consumer surplus is just A, B, and C. Consumers have lost minus D, minus E, minus F, minus G. They lost D, E, F, and G, so that's why I have the minus signs there. Right? They lost that entire region there. That should make sense. They are now paying a higher price. They are not happy about it, right? And they were hurt by the amount of D, E, F, and G. Consumers are hurt by tariffs. Listen to that once again. If we impose tariffs on goods or services coming from abroad, it will hurt consumers. Okay? We will start paying higher prices. So these tariffs that are being considered to be imposed on Mexico, you like that avocado? We get lots of avocado from Mexico, ladies and gentlemen. Avocado prices will start going up. Okay? We get a lot of goods, in fact, from Mexico. In fact, nations' biggest trading partners are their neighbors. Why? Because they're our neighbors. They're so close by. So you may think that it's China because everyone's hearing about China and trade with China, But we actually get most of our goods and services, our trade, when we do trade, we export and import the most from with Mexico and Canada because they are our neighbors. They are so close by. So again, imposing tariffs will harm domestic consumers. Okay. All right. Now, producer surplus, domestic producers love tariffs, right? If the tariff is being imposed on the good that they produce, they're like, hell yes, we are now going to be getting PW plus T because those goods are being taxed at the port. I no longer have to just charge PW. I can charge PW plus T. I'm not competing with as low of a price anymore. And I don't want to just charge PW. Why not charge PW plus T? So they do, and they end up providing more goods to the market. We go from here to here. So that's why producers are happy. They're not only able to sell more units, but they're charging a higher price. And you see there that producer surplus ends up being, here's the price, here's the supply curve, it ends up being D and H. So producers gain region D, which again, it doesn't look like a lot, but it can be significant, that region. Okay. And let me erase the red. Hopefully I don't erase anything else. There we go. So producers gain D. Tax revenue. By definition, tariffs are a tax on imports and only imports. So it's a tax on imports. Here is the size of the tax, and here are the imports between there and there. So this is the size of the tax. These are the imports. Multiply that. You get this area right here. So F ends up becoming tax revenue for the government, and that is a gain to the government. Okay. Total surplus is what? A, B, C, D. I'm going to do it alphabetically. A, B, C, D, F, and H. And coming down this way, assuming I've done everything right, the loss in consumer surplus of D was picked up by producer surplus. The loss in E was not picked up by anyone. The loss in F, if consumer surplus, was picked up and redistributed to the government. So that's a wash. But the loss in G was not picked up by anyone. So what do we have? We have E and G as a negative surplus. We have a word for that, a phrase. Dead weight loss. We have dead weight loss, 3 exclamation marks, because of the imposition of a tariff. And that dead weight loss is that little E and that little G. Okay? We are, as a whole, the nation is worse off with the tariff. We could have picked up E and G, but we didn't. Okay? However, there are winners and losers from the tariff. The winners are the producers because the tariff protects these higher cost producers. And the consumers are worse off because we're paying higher prices now. And notice, by the way, that if you say, well, I'll put $16 billion towards to help those that are harmed by this, right? And so, to help those that are hurt by this, well, you better hope that that $16 billion is covering D, E, F, and G, right? Because that's the damage that is being done. And by the way, and first of all, F isn't enough, right? Your tax revenue of F is not enough. So that means you're going to have to tax elsewhere in order to make up for this D, E, F, and G, right? Right? You're going to have to tax the people elsewhere, so hurt them a little bit more to redistribute to the people in this particular market if you want to supposedly try to, undo the harm that is done by tariffs. The harm that is done by tariffs is not undone. You're just going to pull from another market and try to fix it here. So then that other market is going to be harmed, right? So there's no way to come out winning with a tariff. There's no way in net to be the same, just as well off. It's impossible. After taking this class, you should be able to see that. Okay, so what else do I want to point out here? So the deadweight loss is E and G. And let's see, deadweight loss is E and G. And the E and G is actually, they take on particular properties. Okay, or characterizations. Characterization just means describe. Okay, characterize something, describe it, what happens, why, explain it. And so E, we lost E. Notice why we lost E. Let's focus on the graph for a bit. Notice why we lost E. We lost E because when there's a tariff, domestic producers are like, yeah, we want to provide more to the market. Quantity supplied goes up, right? And so those units represented by that red arrow there are being produced by higher cost producers. That is inefficient. We could have gotten those units between here and here to be produced at a lower cost, lower opportunity cost. That is efficient to get it produced by lower opportunity cost, lower cost producers. But now they're being produced by higher cost producers. If you were this benevolent social planner that cared about the world as a whole, you would want things to be produced at lowest cost, lowest opportunity cost, right? Because you're like, hey, why waste resources on something when you don't have to? Why not make it at lowest opportunity cost? That way we can, have people with the comparative advantage in a particular thing focus on their thing, and if you don't have the comparative advantage, go do something else. You have the comparative advantage in something else, go do that, right? And so we lose E. This E actually has a name. This is what we call the protective effect, also known as the production effect, meaning the impact on the market because it protects domestic producers, right? The protective effect. It is protecting domestic producers. Which ones? Those higher cost producers, right? Protective effect, production effect, same thing. And that is dead weight loss, right? That little region E is dead weight loss. G, look at G. The reason we lost G is because domestic consumers are saying, oh, fuck, higher prices. We don't like higher prices. Quantity demanded is going to go down. So we decrease quantity demanded by this amount here, right? We go down. And so this higher price discourages the consumption of this good. And so G, which looks like this, is what we call the consumption effect. Consumers are discouraged from participating in the market because of this higher price, because we respond to incentives. And that is an incentive not to purchase it because it's higher price. We don't like high prices. And so we end up losing as consumers the value of G just because of that. As consumers, technically we lose D, E, F, and G. But just because we're buying fewer units, that's G. Okay. All right, so we have summarized importing with tariffs and imports alone and also exports alone. Make sure you nail this. Make sure you're able to compute this. Of course, in MindTap, they'll actually give you numbers. Here, I'm just doing it in general form, but you should be able to find areas. And there's so many questions I can ask you here. Right, I can ask, what is the value of the consumption effect? Boom, find the area of G. What is the value of the protective effect? Find the area of E. What is the tax revenue? Okay, we'll find the area of F. What's the size of the tax? How many imports are there? What is the new consumer surplus? A, B, and C. Find that area. What is the loss in consumer surplus? Find the area of D, E, and F. I would do that first, that rectangle. And then find the area of G. Boom, add those up. Right? So there's so many questions that can be asked here. But fundamentally, it's just applying the tools of welfare analysis. It's actually not a hard chapter once you master Chapter 7. So I hope now that we're done with this, you do see, actually she was right. It is one big giant chapter, Chapter 7, 8, and 9. All right, folks, that's it. See you next time.